used mostly is with lower grades, particularly with first and second grade, because if you remember way back to that TESOL overview workshop, we talked about how language instruction isn't required as a national mandate for first and second graders, right? So, however, there is a push for an early start to do that. Yeah, if you have questions, I would encourage you to use the chat box for now. When I have a moment, I will definitely pause, and if you have questions to have, put those hands up, and we'll tackle those. So we're going to see in classrooms, especially in the first and second grade, things like, and in elementary in general, art classes. We'll see it in PE, which might seem like a bit of a head scratcher, like, oh, PE, I was thinking more traditional classes. You'll see sometimes with math or science, particularly life science is a really big one for lower grades, as well as music and English. So most likely if you are asked or placed in a school where you'll be doing CLIL, it'll probably be in one of these subjects, most likely. So we want to discuss some of the challenges that this model sort of has incurred. And we've already kind of touched upon this a little bit already. Because it is not standardized, there is as of yet a real lack of curriculum. So no materials or textbooks for most of these subjects. I will say the exception is PE and life curriculum. There are books, and I'll share with you at the end of the presentation today those books. But your school, if that you're doing CLIL, and those subjects will have them available to you. But because there is a real general lack of CLIL type of textbooks, there's a real inconsistency in content, and it puts a lot more of the burden on the teacher to create this kind of content and to set up quality assessments as well. There's a real lack of time. I don't know if you have started to make contact with your schools and your future co-teachers. Probably you're starting to see that they're quite busy. And to do CLIL definitely requires more work hours than just a traditional open the textbook and teach from that, which seems to be the preferred method for a lot of teachers here. As mentioned before, there's a lack of uniform training around CLIL, which adds to this lack of understanding of what it is exactly. It's difficult to simplify subject material, especially through English if the teacher's English isn't particularly solid, or that teacher doesn't feel very confident in using it as a medium of instruction. And it can be difficult to find a balance between content and language, how much to do of which. So those are some added challenges. Lack of language proficiency, as I touched upon. The students don't feel that they can keep up, or even the content teacher feeling that they don't have adequate English. And one more thing to add to this is a lack of experience in co-teaching. Even though this model, it inherently kind of cultivates an idea of co-teaching outside of just the Fulbright program. Ideally, in a CLIL setting, you would have English teachers working with content teachers and helping to make some of those bridges curricularly and strengthen what's being done in each classroom. But this model of co-teaching is not one that is predominant in a lot of schools either. And as I'm sure some of you will experience in the months to come, can be a challenge just in and of itself. Lastly, there's a lack of data. So this is a relatively new concept to education here in Taiwan. As schools are starting to do it, not uniformly, there hasn't been a lot of data on how successful it is and how it's how that translates and statistically and otherwise. So given that there's all these challenges, you're probably thinking, why are we doing it? Why even have this workshop? Are there any benefits? Of course there are benefits. And some of the ones that we definitely know about is that it facilitates collaboration and innovation between teachers. It helps to stimulate conversation, an important professional conversation, which we want to have. It provides more diverse learning opportunities for students as well. And over time, this is really important, and it can help lower student anxiety about speaking English. Having opportunities to use English in a way that's relevant is really, really important. And there aren't enough of those opportunities in just a standalone English classroom. And another point is that schools with CLIL programs has a marketing sort of allure to it. So they tend to attract more students every year. And in a country where birth rates are going down, that can be quite important for a school in order to keep its doors open. Overall, though, I would say hands down, the biggest advantage is that CLIL classes are really the easiest and most time-efficient way to increase English exposure at school. And this is why inherently it is being embraced. But here's the thing. I know some of you will not be in CLIL specific situations. So whether you're teaching a subject-specific class or English, I want you to keep in mind you are teaching content. So even if it's a standalone English classroom, the things that you teach in that classroom, I want you to think of as content. And so everything that we share and talk about today is absolutely relevant to that endeavor. So in the chat box, I would love for you to share by answering a couple of questions. The first is, how do you feel about teaching in a CLIL setting? So if you could take a moment and in the chat box, share with us that your feelings about CLIL.
Don't be shy. Excited?
Nervous?
Yeah.
How to balance it? For sure. Like the idea of integrating language into tangible activities and lessons. Feels like there's a lot more planning involved, especially without there's more room for creativity, some nervousness. Like it matches my belief about how best to learn and teach languages. Okay. Some enthusiasm there. Good. Excited because there's more room for creative interactive lessons. I think it's a good way to learn language. A little bit worried, some nerves. Just out of curiosity, how many of you know that you will be absolutely for sure in a CLIL setting? If you can just write in the chat box me, that will help. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Chances are, even if you aren't being tapped or know for sure that you're going to be teaching a subject-specific class now, this will be something that you definitely might be asked to do at some point later on. So there's a question about, is CLIL a term that your teachers should be familiar with? And I would say yes, especially if you're at a bilingual school. This should be something that they are familiar with as a term. If not, you can always use content-based instruction. They're very similar in concept, and that might be a little bit more, I guess, user-friendly as a choice word. What questions does this leave you with what I've presented so far about the movement towards CLIL and bilingual education in Taiwan, if any? Okay, that's all right. If you don't have questions yet, or they're just starting to form, let's see if later on more will come about. So we'll keep going here. Ooh, Kelsey, how do actual lesson plans differ between normal English instruction and CLIL lesson planning? That's a great question. I would say that's going to depend very much on the teacher that you work with, because most standalone English classes will have a textbook that they work with. Very typically, that will be the base for the lesson. And in content classes, there may be a content textbook as well, but it will all be in Chinese. And that can provide a challenge if you, as a co-teacher, coming into that setting, don't speak Chinese, don't read it. And yeah, classes will just be called regular science. So it won't be, there will be no English necessarily added on. So they don't have a special name necessarily. But again, that could be something that every school sort of handles differently, because this isn't standardized per se. So a lot of what we're going to share with you today are about best practices in general and ideas to take with you. These ideas may not be ones that you find necessarily in practice at your school, so it's important to keep in mind that these are sort of an ideal, but what we want to present you with is something that still could be realistic to your setting. And very important to all of this is going to be conversation, making sure that you're talking a lot about these things with your co-teachers, that to make sure that you're on the same page about them, to introduce maybe some new ideas. If they seem to be not embracing these ideas per se themselves, they may not be aware of them. So CLIL or EFL, so EFL being English as a foreign language, what are those best practices? We want to give you, regardless of what setting you're going to be in, sort of this idea of how do we do a good job in the classroom? What should we be looking out for? We're going to base a lot of these ideas off of what's called SIOP. And SIOP stands for Sheltered Instruction Observational Protocol. This is a very lengthy phrase. It's not all that important for you to remember. You don't even really need to remember SIOP per se. It's just that these ideas are coming from this collection of research and writing that were developed by several practitioners in the field. And what I like about it, and the reason why I'm really wanting to share this with you all, is that regardless of what type of educational setting you're in, it could be a content class, dual language, it can be ESL, EFL, special education. These are concepts that you can use regardless of what situation you're in. So there's a great I cannot speak today. They're very adaptable. And that's the principle that I want to take with this. As we're going through this, think about with what limited information you might have now about your setting, how these might be applicable to where you're going to be in a few weeks. These three women derived a wonderful book called Making Content Comprehensible for English Learners. And this is where they introduce this idea of the SIOP model. So if what we present with you and share with you today is something that you feel particularly interested in and would like to read up further about, you can find a lot of their work in this particular book. I have a PDF copy of it. I'm more than happy to share with you if at some point later on you'd like to have that as a resource. All right. So in its core, SIOP entails 8 basic components, and which can be broken down into a total of 30 features. And the thing that I like about SIOP is you can use it not only in elementary schools, but you can use it with middle school, it works with high school, it works with university, it works with learners in general. What we're going to do now is break down these components and features, and then we're going to just spend some time really highlighting the ones that we think will be most applicable and relevant to your situations coming up. So you can see here that among a lot of this makes a lot of sense, right? A very basic component is lesson preparation. How do I prepare for my lesson? The ideas and the thoughts that I need to consider and putting a lesson together. Building background, comprehensible input, strategies. What strategies do I want to use? How do I want to build an interaction? When it comes to actual practice and application of what I'm teaching students, how do I integrate that into the lesson? What does my lesson delivery actually look like? And how do I review and assess? So we can see kind of a full cycle of a lesson here, broken down into these 8 components. If we go a little bit further in detail, we'll see these 30 features highlighted a little bit more. And I bring them up because I think they all hold a certain relevance that we want to think about in our teaching. So when we're thinking about starting off a lesson and preparing, we want to think about our objectives. So things like content objectives, language objectives, content concepts appropriate for age and level. We don't want to be teaching high school material to elementary students. We want to make sure that it's leveled appropriately for their language. We want to think about what supplemental materials we might want to pull in to the class. And if we do have a textbook or set curriculum, what might we need to adapt content-wise and supplement with those meaningful activities? So those are all features that go into that lesson preparation. Makes sense. We want to think through those things. When it comes to building background, we want to start thinking about, okay, how do we link this idea to my students? Remember, we want to make sure we build interest and relevance to our students, that we're not just teaching them randomly different pieces of information and expecting them to just learn it. We want to connect it to them. So we have to think about that in our planning. We also want to build off of things that they've already learned. So how do we link new ideas to old ones? And we want to be mindful of vocabulary. Vocabulary is going to be really, really helpful in building backgrounds and knowing what words students are already familiar with and being able to connect them to new words as well. So those are ideas and features that connect to building background. Then we want to examine comprehensible input. What do we mean by that? How do we make what we deliver to students actually understandable to them? So we want to think about, how am I speaking? Am I speaking too quickly? Am I speaking too slowly? We want to make sure we moderate that it's appropriate to the level of our students. We want to make sure in our lesson delivery that our explanations are clear. And we can do that using a variety of techniques, putting multiple entry points into the lesson. So our students with all their diverse needs can each find a way into that content and material. So these are ideas that go into this bigger concept or component of comprehensible input. And if you remember back from our TESOL overview workshop a while ago, we had introduced this idea as being one of Krashen, who's sort of one of our forefathers of the TESOL field. And he has this whole idea about comprehensible input never being overly challenging, that we should be at the level with maybe a little bit more. So I plus 1, I being input plus like 1 more, which is, again, a theory, a concept. We're not going to dive much further into it, but I just wanted to reference that to you. Okay, moving on. We want to also, in the scope of thinking through our lessons and how we teach, be sure that we are using learning strategies with them, using those scaffolding techniques that we've talked about, and also incorporating critical thinking. How do we make sure that we're asking of our students to do things that encourage greater critical thought and doing? So that goes into the idea of strategies. That's a lot of features right there that I've covered, and that's only half of them. So we're going to take a moment to kind of check in. So far, which of these do you think would be the easiest to use, and which do you think would be the hardest? So take a moment in the chat box to share your thoughts. I'll go back to the other slide so you can see them. Yeah, that might be easier. Scaffolding will be challenging at first. Yeah. Having multiple entry points. So Jackson, do you think that'll be easier or more difficult?
I think that'd be more difficult just because I think you'd have to, like, it's a lot more thought behind like trying to anticipate how students might differently need to have an entry point and then kind of plan around that in effective ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Clear explanations will improve slowly on that. Objectives relatively straightforward. Ensuring you give clear and comprehensible input. Explanations can be hard. Hard to think of several lessons. Might be developing critical thinking. Key vocabulary might be on the easier end. So, okay, clear explanation scaffolding will be tough to get used to at first. Easiest vocab, hardest scaffolding. Right. So those things like scaffolding, multiple entry points, giving clear explanations, that will take time. It will take time to think through. It will take time to kind of build some of those concepts in your head, just to think about, oh yes, these are all the things I need to juggle and think about in lesson planning. And as you come to know your students and their needs better, it will also make some of that planning a little bit easier, because you'll understand what to prepare, how better to prepare and meet those needs. But that all takes time. So keeping that in mind, that the expectation isn't that you're going to be masters at all of this straight out of the hatch, straight out of quarantine. That this will take time is important as well. But it is something to strive towards, to be working towards, and maybe thinking about setting small goals for yourself week by week of things that you want to work on in your lesson planning, in your teaching. All right, are you feeling ready for the next 15 features? Not to overwhelm, but again, this is just an introduction. So the next part is dealing with interaction. When we're actually in the classroom and providing opportunities for kids to work together, we want to find as many opportunities for them to use language as possible instead of just talking at them, right? And part of that, what can help us, is how we group students. So thinking about pair work, group work, seating charts. We also want to think about our wait time. How much time do we give students to process and think about the information that we're sharing with them? And there are going to be moments where it might be very helpful for us to clarify key concepts in the first language. And this is always, I think, a place of push and pull for ETAs and those working in sort of bilingual settings, is how much of instruction should be a native language versus the target language. And that's something that you'll have to feel out in your setting. So those all deal with the component of interaction. Moving on, we also want to think about kinesthetic learning. So kinesthetic is incorporating movement in our learning. How do we do that? How do we get students moving about? How do we apply that content and language knowledge? So it's not just about giving students the information, it's about giving them an opportunity to actually use it and apply it. And to integrate all the language skills. So making sure we have reading, writing, speaking, and listening incorporated into those lessons. This all comes into the practice and application component. When when it comes to the actual delivery of a lesson, we want to make sure that we're meeting those content objectives. We're meeting those language objectives. So those things that we did in the preparation phase of this. We want to make sure students are engaged. Yes, we want them to have fun, but we also want to make sure that they're active in their own learning, that they're not falling asleep, they're not off finding distraction. We want to be cognizant of our pacing of a lesson, how quickly we move through things, where we might need to slow down. And this is one of those things that will take time for sure. All of this comes into play with lesson delivery as a key component of SIOP. And lastly, we want to make sure when we go into review and assessment that we have review of vocabulary, key vocabulary incorporated. Same with the key content concepts, so that we're not just introducing these things, but we're actively making sure we incorporate their review. This helps with retention, that we're giving students regular feedback, and that we're assessing students' comprehension and learning throughout. So each of these each of these components in and of themselves could be their own workshop. And in fact, we'll be touching on a lot of these things in the workshops that we have planned in the semester ahead with you. The idea is not that, again, I want to underscore it, is not that you need to be a master of all these things, but it's a lot to think about in lesson planning. So right now, just to touch base with you, again in the chat box, take a moment and share with us what SIOP features overall do you think you'll have the most control over? And what features would you like that should say no to know more about? I'll go back again, just so you have that list in front of you. So which of these do you think you'll have the most control over in the classroom? And which ones would you like to know a bit more about? I'd like to know more about integrating all skills. Pacing might have control over wait time, group configurations. Okay. Really want to integrate all language skills. Yeah. Want to know how to best assess student comprehension and learning. Meeting all the various objectives would be the thing I have the most control, knowing how to assess. Okay. Control over pacing, want to know more about regular feedback. Okay. How to keep students engaged, more about regular feedback and student assessment. Okay. Right, lots of ideas here for us as presenters too. It's really helpful for us to get an idea of where you might feel you'd like to have more information for future workshops. Learn more about incorporating kinesthetic learning. Okay. All right. So again, the idea here, we're going to be introducing things, learn more about assessments, how to use that information. Okay. So how can we incorporate these ideas in a co-teaching context? We have a lot of things that we have to juggle and think about here. If we think of an instructional cycle with SIOP, I really like how this graphic lays things out. If we think about before we go into the lesson, we're going to be co-planning. We're going to be lesson focused on the lesson preparation, the building background, the comprehensible input, the strategies, the interactions. So those are those key components of SIOP that we want to be focused on. that phase of the teaching cycle. But where we want to spend most of our time today is focused on the actual co-teaching part. This will be thinking also about building background and comprehensible input, strategies, interaction, but also lesson delivery and practice and application. So we're going to spend a bit more time focused on these features to give a bit more detail and ideas of how you might approach these in your co-teaching context. Of course, it all does start with lesson preparation. And so I think really key to all of this is making sure whenever you go into planning a lesson that you're asking yourself and your co-teacher these questions. What are our content and language objectives? So what do we want to make sure we're getting out of this? Our students will be able to learn by the end or know by the end of the lesson and be able to do both language-wise and content. And it's important to know who determines these objectives. Is this coming from a book? Is this coming from the teachers themselves? Are you responsible? For what part of this are you yourself responsible? And then, of course, how will you reach these objectives? And that how will be the core of your lesson planning. It will be the lesson itself. So I like this graphic here too, because it helps us to think about all the different kind of features and things we want to make sure that we take into consideration in preparing the lesson. A lot goes into this phase for sure. Okay. But I want to dive in and have a bit of a closer look at a few other features. So let's talk about building background. If you remember, just a few minutes ago when I introduced these features, with building background, we want to link concepts to students. We want to link new concepts to old ones. And we want to focus on key vocabulary. And of these, I think the ones that can be most helpful right now to focus on are linking those concepts to students. So making that connection of like, why is this important? Why is this relevant? And also building upon prior knowledge. A lot of this goes back to some of the scaffolds that we talked about also in previous workshops. So a lot of this stuff is very interrelated. How can we do that? One way is to brainstorm. Whenever you're starting a new unit, where you're introducing new content to students, new vocabulary, you might want to brainstorm and find out, what do students already know about this topic? What if you're perhaps you're not in a content you're not in a CLIL specific class, a subject specific class, but you're discussing fruit. Fruit is the new unit. That is a content. You could start by asking students, what fruits do they know already? Supplement those visuals. Supplement with visuals that students are already familiar with. I think that's also really helpful. If you're talking about fruit, have examples of fruit. You could certainly go out and buy a lot and bring it in, but also just having pictures is really great. And I'm sure will be something that you'll become very familiar with putting together in PowerPoints and such. So that is a really great way to link what students already know and to build upon what they already know. Also, providing sentence starters using language students are already familiar with can be a great way to help move and build upon that previous knowledge. So those are just a few ways to build background. As for comprehensible input, so this is the next component that we want to discuss and touch upon. The features here that we're going to focus on are speech, appropriate to level, clear explanations, and providing a variety of techniques and having multiple entry points. Specifically here, we want to make sure that we are really balancing between repetition, but also mixing things up. So it's going to be really important that not only are we slowing down, using words that we know students are familiar with, trying to avoid a lot of our euphemisms, our slang words, really thinking through about how we're going to explain instructions and how to do things. But we want to make sure that we do incorporate repetition, but also when we're introducing new activities when we're doing activities in students, having some that we've done before can be helpful, because as it comes with explaining how to do things newly, that can be a bit challenging and eat up a lot of your class time. So if you've explained an activity, and you find yourself doing it again a few lessons later, that can be very helpful. But of course, you don't want to always be doing the same thing over and over and over again in the classroom. So having some sort of balance between that will be important as well. So to talk a little bit more, because I know this is a point that made a lot of you nervous about giving clear instructions, take note. We'll talk a little bit more about it here. So keep in mind that bad instructions can be a real time waster. We want to make sure that we're really thinking through how we want to explain things. Clear instructions prevent lesson breakdowns. You might find an amazing activity. Just know that an amazing activity becomes an amazing disaster without unclear instructions. So the instructions part of your planning is super important, and it's often one that gets neglected. Clear instructions also actually help students to process and develop language proficiency. So it's a great way to infuse language. I see a lot of times our co-teachers, our local co-teachers, will want to speed through the lesson because there is limited time, and want to maximize the activity time. And so very often we'll give instructions in native language. That's not a terrible thing. However, it's a missed opportunity for using more target language in the classroom, and especially a great way to help get students used to hearing a place of repetition if you're doing a lot of activities across the board in your lessons. Also, something to keep in mind is understanding and following along has a motivating effect for students. So we take pride when we understand what to do. We get excited about it. And if we don't know what to do, we often lose interest and we disengage. So to avoid chaos, keep in mind when giving instructions, clear instructions. You want to speak clearly, simply, and slowly. And this is a great place to elaborate using visuals and gestures as needed. Model your instructions. Demonstrate the activity with your co-teacher or with your students. Make sure you get your students' attention. Do not talk over a noisy classroom. Make sure that those students are quiet. You use your attention getters to get their full attention before you start giving instructions. Keep in mind also, these are some helpful hints and tips, is to arrange student groups. If you're having students work in groups for this and they've been sitting in a more traditional seating chart, make sure you do that arranging of furniture in groups before you give instructions, not after. You also want to avoid any handouts or other materials, like distributing those before you give instructions, because once they have them, they're going to want to touch them and play with them. And you should also make sure that you are breaking down your instructions into simple steps. Give students a time limit and those checks for understanding. Do not ask, do you understand? Make sure you're asking more concept checking questions instead, like what's the first thing we need to do? What's step number 1? So those are some well-worn tips that I highly encourage you follow in your instruction delivery. So a simple activity here, and I'd love for you in the chat box to try to simplify the instructions that I'm going to put on here. This is a little task of how can we simplify these instructions. So if my original instruction is, now I'd like for you to get out a piece of paper and put it on your desk, how could I simplify that instruction? I'd love to see your ideas in the chat box. Everyone put a piece of paper on your desk, please. It's very polite language, Malka. Put a piece of paper on your desk. You can model it yourself, okay? Place one piece of paper on the desk. Put a paper on your desk. Okay. Take out a piece of paper. Yeah, paper out, pencil out. So if you start with the verb, a great way with instructions is to start with the verb, the action, and limit the amount of words. And as you get to know your students, you'll become more familiar with what words they know, what actions they know. But Aiden, I really liked your suggestion of also modeling this. That's always something we want to do with every instruction that we give whenever possible. How about this one? Now, once the paper is on the desk, could you please write down 5 questions using the present continuous tense? How could I make those set of instructions simpler? Write 5 questions in present continuous tense. That's pretty simple. Next, write 5 questions using present continuous tense. Good. So, very similar ideas. All right, let's try this one. Now that you have written 5 questions, I would like for you to fold the paper in half. How would you simplify these instructions? Now, fold the paper in half. Okay. Fold your paper in half. And demonstrate. I like that, Kelsey. And demonstrate. Yeah, that can make it really clear. So notice here, we're not using polite language. I think it's okay not to say please, not to say next, especially if you have it in writing and you're doing it step by step with the students. I think that's okay to take out some of that language if that helps to simplify. Last one. Now when I turn on the music, please pass your paper to the person on the left, and I would like for you to continue passing your papers until the music stops. How would you simplify that? Pass your paper to the left when you hear the music. When I turn on the music, pass your paper till the music stops. Pass your paper to the left. Okay. And again, more examples with our co-teacher. Keep passing your paper to the left until the music stops. Yeah. When the music, another way, those are all fine. Yeah, I like hear the music pass your paper left. We don't want to leave out important preposition words. So we want to simplify our language, but we also don't want to be inauthentic with our language, which is a balance, right? So keeping prepositions, I think, are important. Pass your papers to the left. And I think this is a great one where we can really demonstrate all of these and model along the way to help explain what we expect from students. But you can see even on the original sort of instructions seem quite normal, seem quite fine, but even these can be sometimes a bit too wordy depending on the level of students you might be working with. So keep in mind, how can you simplify as much as possible what to do without losing the integrity of the actual instruction? Lots to think about for sure. All right. Another thing we should take a little bit of a closer look at is strategies. What are some strategies? We want to make sure we're using them. We want to make sure we're scaffolding. We know that this will take time, that this is a challenge. if you recall, and it's okay if you don't, but some workshops ago, we introduced these 6 scaffolds: modeling, bridging, contextualizing, schema building, text representation, and developing metacognition. Some of these sound a lot fancier than they actually are. And a lot of these, I'm sure, if you reflect on your own experience as a learner, were done for you by your instructors and teachers and professors. Modeling is a very obvious one of showing what you're doing. Bridging is building upon those old concepts with new, so it's also a SciOp feature. Contextualizing is helping to bring things alive through pictures, through other ways of building more context around what you're instructing on. So it's using a lot of visual aids and realia. So those are some of the most common ones to use. I wouldn't worry about knowing all of them fluently, but one thing we want to make sure is we're reaching our learners and providing places for them to grab onto within a lesson where they can feel they can continue to progress at a rate that is according to where they are as a learner. And the last thing we want to make sure that we're doing when we're considering this particular component is incorporating those higher order thinking questions and tasks. And one tool that helps a lot with this is Bloom's taxonomy. I think we've briefly introduced this idea before. This I recommend having next to you when you're doing your lesson planning. Very often we focus on understanding and remembering tasks. So having students remember or memorizing words, vocabulary, certain sentence patterns or small grammar points. But what we want to see, where we see real language acquisition happen, is when we start to apply that language. When we start having students do more than just memorize words, they're actually using them in a given context. So building opportunities to do that. And just as Effie mentioned, there's lots of resources on Bloom's online. This sort of pyramid is one that is posted a lot. It's referred to a lot. And so pushing your lessons and incorporating in the activities a way for your students to apply and create with the language that you're giving them will really help them to start to retain more of that, the language that you're giving to them. Helps to build that proficiency. All right. So we've been at this for an hour now. It's a lot of information I've thrown at you. I'd like for us to take a 20-minute break. I'm going to have Effie talk a little bit more here and sort of pass the torch, figurative torch, over to her.
Yeah, so before I set us up for this activity and for break, I am going to circle back to a question, or actually 2 questions that came up in the chat box related to middle school and high school levels. So I was wondering if, Kara, you knew the answer to this. What might CLIL look like in higher levels? Because I'm not sure if it's actually a concern or if CLIL is a type of course that they have for the higher levels. Course format.
I guess I'm not fully understanding the question. So I'm not sure what goes on at the high school level. We don't have a lot of interaction with high schools in Taiwan or programs specifically, and I haven't been invited into a Taiwanese high school to be able to speak to that. A lot of testing is a huge part of the culture here. So
yeah,
as you get closer and closer to those upper grades, you'll see more and more of an emphasis on teaching to the test. So I can't speak to that. Where I see CLIL being embraced most fully is in lower elementary schools. But you do find it in middle school as well. So I don't want to discount that this is only a elementary school concept. It's when I taught, I spent 9 years teaching in New York City public schools, and 7 of those years was specifically in a CLIL context, or content-based instruction. So I was teaching English literature to non-native English students, most of them coming in with very little to no English. It can be done, but there's lots of different ways to do it. So hence the workshop.
Yeah. Thanks for that insight. And yes, here is the link to the doc. So for the activity, if you click on that link in the chat box, you'll find the context, the link to the video, in which we only want you to watch about 6 minutes, a very short segment that I actually give you the timestamp on, just from 1 minute, 40 seconds to the 7-minute mark. So just a segment of the link. And we're gonna take a slightly longer break so that you can watch the video, and then we'll come back. You can use the guidelines, the questions as guidelines that's found on that link. Any questions before we break? All right, so we'll come back at around 3:20. I think everybody's on Taiwan time. Yes? Great, so 20 minutes. Okay, is everybody back? Hopefully you had a nice break. I'm sure it was good to see something in action about all of this, what we've been talking about with Edgar. So let's go ahead and go through the questions that were posted. Okay, so if you could just type into the chat box, what were some things you observed Edgar doing to pre-teach or review the concepts? Establishing key vocabulary, okay? And remember, the objective was students should be able to talk about the life cycle of a butterfly. Repetition, good. Hand gestures. References the story of the hungry caterpillar. Yeah, having the students read the objective out loud. Funny voices, yeah, changing his tone, his voicing. Okay, those are all things that he did to sort of provide background for the content. Let's go on to the next PSYOP component. So comprehensible input, and this is, you're going to have some overlaps in terms of the things that he did, strategies. So examples of how he provides this for students so that they understand. And this was first grade, so young learners. Pictures and hand demonstrations. Okay, good. Having students warm up. I missed that one before. Assigning each stage a number to follow. Good. So showing the process of that. 1, 2, 3, 4, and emotion. Hand motions, sing-songy voice for memorization, repetition again. He was loud, yes. Yeah, volume was important, especially for younger learners. Okay, great. Let's go on to the next component. Again, overlaps. So strategies that Edgar uses so that the lesson is content-oriented, but also language-focused. So this was a CLIL class. Specifically, how did he marry the language instruction with the content? So this was a life science class. For one, he stuck with the content. He didn't go off track. Okay, repetition of key vocabulary science terms, yeah. Repeating the words over and over. Anything else? Okay, if you guys could also, after the key vocab words, he incorporated them into full sentences, showed them a song with the full sentences. Yeah, so he provided, he scaffolded really the vocabulary, and then moving on to full sentences that illustrated the process or the life cycle of the butterfly, and then showing the bigger picture. So all of that was related and aligned to the objective, the content. So if you guys could also right now just take a moment and type in anything that you particularly enjoyed about watching this clip. So this could just be some insight for yourself or something you thought was very effective. The hand motions looked fun. The animation, the energy. Focused yet playful. The teacher really had the class's attention. Okay. His rapport with his co-teacher, Rita, yes. Yeah, he had a whole routine for the class already. Eyes on the board, ears listening, lips closed. Seamless, yes. Now, moving on, any critiques? Edgar's not here, so you can give some maybe constructive criticism about what you observed. What was the device he was using to assign points? I'm not sure, actually.
He was using Class Dojo. So this is like an app that a lot of teachers use as a classroom management piece, and it awards students points, and their parents can even check and keep tabs on them.
Okay, the point system I didn't fully understand, but it's not a bad thing. Okay, maybe asking any of the individual students to answer what is step one. Yeah, so to elicit before just launching into the content. Checks for understanding. Okay, we will have the full lesson, the series of videos of Edgar available for you at the end of the presentation if you want to actually go back and watch more. So, I mean, obviously you just watched a small snippet of what was happening. Okay, great. I also wanted to, let's see what's on the slide actually. Yeah, so delivery, what's effective. Okay, I also wanted to go back. There was something on the document about co-teaching. So what did you observe, aside from the rapport that Edgar had with Rita, teacher Rita, what type of co-teaching was happening? Because all of you will be doing this no matter the context. So in terms of the co-teaching aspects, one teach, one supportive co-teaching, okay? Yeah, and they were definitely working together. That's not always going to be the case. You might switch roles often. You might have a different type of model for that specific class. But in this case, it was effective to have Edgar sort of lead the class and have Rita as backup support and to circle around the room and monitor everybody's progress. Okay. So now we're going to have a closer look. We're going back to the COP components. So we're going to talk a little bit more about interaction, frequent opportunities for interaction. As you can see on the visual there are different ways to configure a classroom. And you won't always have control over this. In fact, I've been told that a lot of LETs, they're not necessarily going to be willing to experiment too much with this, or it might be a little bit of a hassle to have to reconfigure rooms just for one activity, for example. But it is something that can increase interaction when you do have small group work, or if you have an activity that would necessitate some kind of, desk arrangement, that kind of thing. So in terms of interaction, what other things pop to your mind for student interaction? What are things that increase or perhaps decrease student interaction? When we're talking about CLIL, what might happen with content delivery if students don't understand? For example, if you're teaching in a life science context and there's a lot to cover, there's a lot of vocabulary, and you might have to switch into the L1, how could you support that in terms of student engagement? So this is something that might come up. Use of L1 Chinese. Any ideas? Do you think this is something you should discuss with your co-teacher beforehand so it doesn't come up during the class? Or for those of you who speak Chinese, do you just switch into Chinese? The teacher most comfortable with L1 could help explain if we notice, okay? use both? Yeah. I think for a CLIL or content-based instruction English class, you will have to use L1. The question about how often, how little, how much, that'll be something you'll need to communicate and focus on with your LET. I'm seeing more ideas here. Focus on the basic essential vocab words pertaining to the lesson. Okay, yeah. I think it's best to discuss with co-teachers. Good. All right, yeah, these are all under that umbrella of interaction is actually the use of L1. Wait time is another one, and this has to do with, a strategy or comprehensible input as well. So again, there are some overlaps. I think in general, you want to, be able to gauge if your students need a little bit more time, or, like even right now, as I'm delivering this online, it's hard to gauge in this online setting. So I realize some of these questions that we ask can either be too broad or might require some thinking. So it's best to kind of wait it out, even if there's a little bit of awkwardness. With older learners, should ETAs be more willing to avoid using L1? Not necessarily. I think it really depends on the lesson objectives, the content, and it depends on your LET's approach to it as well. You might have LETs who will actually use more Chinese than you feel comfortable with. So that's definitely something you'll need to discuss with them.
You might also be requested by your school, if you already know Chinese, not to use Chinese in the classroom. So that's also something that, a situation that some ETAs find themselves in. So just be aware that that might be dictated by your school as well.
Yeah, and I think it'll be important to clarify your role with the LET. Do they only want you to come in with vocabulary and English only, or are you fully supporting the content objectives, the lesson? All right, let's go to the next slide. So the next one is lesson delivery. This is a bit out of order, but I don't think it matters because we have 30 features in the entire SIOP model. In terms of lesson delivery, again, you want any type of activity that's happening in the classroom, you want it aligned and connected back to your objectives. So while it's fun to have fun games, it's fun to have fun activities, do these fun things connect back to the students will be able to? So unless it's some kind of break time or activity solely for fun, you do want to make sure it's aligned to the objectives. And then in terms of reflection, review and assessment, that's sort of the last part of the model. All of your objectives should be observable, measurable, and assessed. So when we go back to students, we'll be able to name the 4 stages of a butterfly life cycle. I'm typing this up. What could you say is observable, measurable, and accessible about just that singular objective? So what you saw Edgar do, if you were to go back and actually do some assessment, what could you do with that objective? That's observable, measurable, accessible. So in other words, how would you assess this objective? And could you? I mean, that's how you test if an objective is clear enough. Having students be able, in order, state the stages, yeah. If you can imagine a worksheet, they should be able to fill it in. So if you have a picture of a caterpillar, they could perhaps number it. This would be for a younger level. Ask students at the end of class how many stages of the life cycle there are and to name them. Okay, yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so something that's not covered in this, the lesson delivery part, is teacher talk. So in terms of how much or how little you talk, this is something that you'll have to gauge in the class. It depends on the lesson. It depends on what's happening in the classroom. It also depends on your LET. But just keep in mind that the more you lecture or the more you talk, the less engaged your students might be, or the less they will. So this is something that happens, as teachers, we're expected to talk. Sometimes, that's the pressure that you have, is that, it's all about teacher talk time. But in order to transition into more student-centered learning, you definitely want to make sure that aside from, pacing, scaffolding, wait times, all of that, that your students have the chance and that they do talk. Okay, so pacing, that's something we already talked about. Also, something to keep in mind is the attention span typical of students' ages. I'm sure you can Google or find research on this, organized by students' age ranges. But in general, having taught for so long, I think we could argue that, typical attention spans might be shorter, especially when it comes to teacher talk time. So just be aware of that. How information or content is chunked or organized. So a particular objective might span 1 to 2 classes, or it could just be one unit that you cover in a class time. But how it fits into the bigger picture and how that information is divided, that's important to be aware of. Your students' proficiency levels, also possible extension activities. So something I forgot to ask you guys on what was observed were what was some activities you could think of to help enhance or support Edgar's lesson. So what could you have students do with the butterfly life cycle in addition to what happened in the class? Like what could they do for homework maybe? An exit slip with the 4 stages, okay. I think that was for the objective. Draw and label the butterfly life cycle, okay. Draw the 4 stages, good. We could do some arts and crafts. Okay, and then as you guys observed how time is utilized, so Edgar spent a good amount of time in the beginning just doing classroom management, checking in with students, making sure that they were going to pay attention. So the amount of time that you devote to routines, that's part of the lesson delivery, sometimes the most important part. Okay, here are some classic ideas for lesson delivery. They might not all fit for younger levels. So some of these, they might not all work, but here's a list of ideas. Think, pair, share, chunk and chew, Roman review, board race, roll the dice, jigsaw. Questions about any of these? And do you have any other ideas that you can add to the list?
So one thing I would just challenge you guys is very often LETs and your co-teachers are going to be asking you to fill the lesson with activities that supplement whatever you're teaching content-wise. And these are some activities that you can fall on. I know one of the Google Classroom assignments was also to take a look at some websites and to draw upon make a small list of other activities that you liked from that. Activities are great, and having things in your back pocket super important, especially for emergencies. But one thing that's really important is keeping in mind, do the activities meet objectives? Are they helping to drive the lesson towards that? We want to make sure that whatever activity we have is not just about filling space and time and keeping kids having fun. Those are important things, but that they are connected very much to the goals of the lesson.
Yeah, so going back, what are some other activities or things that you've done even in your college classes that were part of the lesson besides what's on the screen? These could be for online classes too. Creating short skits from vocab, okay? So a little bit of role play. Yeah, write on small whiteboards and hold them up. I like that. Analog, not everything has to be digital. Any other ideas or questions? Drawing out vocabulary or actions, okay? Art, very powerful. Okay, let's move on to practice and application. So in terms of what's actually going to be applied or what you're using, we've mentioned before you want to try to use multimodal things. So for example, not just digital, but also, actual paper, like going back traditional pen and paper, drawing. But you do want to practice the material in short, meaningful amounts. So again, being able to scaffold and connect back to the objectives. Older learning is distributed practice, so spacing practice periods farther and farther apart. Any questions? Okay. So activities provided for students to apply content and language knowledge. So well-designed CLIL provides students with meaningful content plus comprehensible input. So going back to Krashen, it has to be digestible for students. So meaningful chunks, enough scaffolding. So examples of when students can organize new information on a graphic organizer and then use that for review. We're going to have some concrete examples in the next slide. If they can connect the content to their real life in meaningful ways. So in terms of the butterfly life cycle, what are some ways you could connect that to students' personal lives? So at that age, first grade level, how can they connect that? Not necessarily, solutions to problems. We're just talking about butterfly life cycle, but what's a way you could connect that to students' real lives? How can we make it personal for them? Yeah, look for butterflies outside. There are butterflies around in Taiwan. I've seen many, even in Taipei. Any other ideas? Could you maybe connect that to their own awareness at that age of the human life cycle? Make some comparisons there. Okay, maybe use materials that are popular amongst their age group. Lessons planned. Yeah, I love that. I love that you're trying to connect to their real lived experiences at that young, precious age, and to the cultural context. Yeah, so it might require you to do a little bit of homework on your own. What are the kids watching in Taiwan in first grade? What are some popular cartoons? Cooking recipes that utilizes 4 steps. Good. Yeah, you could draw some parallels with teaching process. It could also be another type of process that happens in life sciences, if we're connecting back to the CLIL context for that particular class. Okay, all of those are great ideas. Let's go on to the next slide. So here are some examples of graphic organizers. You might have heard this term before. You can find many online. Sometimes, lots of teachers will create their own. You shouldn't have to spend too much time. But, KWL, which is what you know, what you want to know, and what you've learned. So sort of a before, during, and after, those types of charts you could use for any type of subject. Mind maps, so like for brainstorming, labeling, matching, Venn diagrams, flowcharts, foldables. There are many. Okay. So again, not to isolate the 4 skills, is you have to think about how they all come together. In addition to the lesson objectives and using multimodal ways to practice and apply the content, you have to also constantly think about, how is this practicing listening skills? How am I integrating opportunities for reading and writing? What about speaking? So it might seem like a lot, but I think it's just an awareness that all of these things have a role and they're integrated, they come together. It's not isolated. The critical thinking part, even at the first grade level, this is something that you can begin to expand on and extend in your lesson delivery. So I know that in Taiwan, traditionally a lot of the teaching and the content can seem to be more textbook oriented, test based, as we talked about earlier with high school levels. But in terms of trying to encourage and inspire critical thinking, this is something where you can integrate even at a very, very early level. So asking students questions after the lesson on the butterfly life cycle, connecting that to their lives, but also asking them deeper questions. How do you think the butterflies in Taiwan, I'm trying to think of a good question, but I'm blanking out. But a way to deepen the content further. Okay, so integrate, communicate, don't isolate. So opportunities to do so through structured interaction with peers, avoid relying on native language for giving instructions. We talked a little bit about this. There are times where you will have to switch into L1, or the LET will, that'll be their job. Guiding students to use sentence starters and signal words, providing learners with the chance to listen and react to peers' ideas, and asking students to write about what is being learned. Okay, and here are just more review for practice and application. These are already listed, some of these. And again, what ideas do you have? Anything we didn't cover? Or going back to critical thinking, if there's anything you can think of that might deepen or develop critical thinking based on Edgar's lesson, we can use that as context. Will most classes use microphones? Some teachers will have microphones, so the LET. Yeah, it's common. So if you're worried about being loud enough with a microphone, you won't have to be concerned with that.
Your school will probably not provide you with a microphone. Your LET or co-teacher might have an extra one for you to use. I find them kind of weird personally. And I never felt comfortable using one. And so I would just use my regular classroom voice. I feel I can speak and amplify well enough. But I think a lot of teachers rely on them as a classroom management tool, in part because they don't want to, I've had this used as an excuse, is like they don't want to speak over their students. And I think it's more of a classroom management opportunity to teach your students how to quiet down when you need their attention rather than trying to talk over them with a louder contraption.
But also you're going to have a mask on. So we're still in the stages of coming out of the pandemic. So in all public spaces,
mask on as well.
Yeah,
so.
You're going to have a mask on. And for those of us who wear glasses, that's something I think about. I do have contacts, but when I have a mask on and glasses on, they tend to fog up when I speak. So just other considerations in terms of not just how your voice is going to project with a mask on, but if you have glasses on, things like that. Sorry, Kara, were you going to say something? Okay. Yeah, so any more ideas or questions that you guys might have? Okay, so what you see here is a rubric. It's actually one part of the SIOP rubric that will include all of the components that we talked about in their respective categories. I don't have a link for this. It's a handout, it's a PDF that we're going to post in Google Classroom. So you can refer to that later. It's about 2 pages, so pretty straightforward. It basically, if you felt like all of these components in one workshop were overwhelming, you can find them on this rubric. They will be listed in a very organized way for you to review.
And just to clarify, this rubric is not one that we will use on you when we come to observe you. This is just for your own reference. So if you're wanting to see how CLIL friendly or perhaps even just best practice friendly you are in your classroom, this could be a helpful tool that you use to self-observe. The QR codes that are here are a way for you to link to get the full document until we can post all the materials in Google Classroom for you.
Yeah, this is really just more pedagogical stuff that we're giving you. It's nothing to intimidate you. It's basically to ensure that you feel empowered and a little bit more confident about CLIL, given that it's very early beginnings in Taiwan's 2030 Bilingual Nation Initiative, and that this is just being tested out in various classroom settings, and there are no clear standards, as Kara mentioned. So it's a frontier. Okay, so we do have the links for Edgar's class, more footage for you if you want to observe the class further. So a lot more content for you to watch. This is optional, but it's available for you. And then just some resources. What's going to be posted in Google Classroom, you'll be able to click on the links. So we'll have all of this available for you. Okay. Yeah, so just to reiterate what I mentioned earlier, if anything, this is to empower you and so that you don't feel like, oh, overwhelmed or that you're alone. Any other takeaways you guys want to type in the chat box? Thank you. Great. Other takeaways? Good. Or any small detail that you were able to grasp onto or something that you learned? Okay. Any more questions? All right, so you can look for all of these on Google Classroom. That's our learning management system for everything. If you want to reach out to us through email or line by line, we could send anything specific out to you by those means as well. All right, thank you. All right, take care, everyone. We'll hopefully see you all soon in person at some point.